And we will go ahead and get started so that we can be sure to have plenty of time to cover the content and have questions. Cassandra, if you could move to the next slide. Oh, okay, I got it. So this is the first Project Director Learning Community Call focused on housing and housing challenges and opportunities specific to the AOT population. This is Melissa Neal. I am the lead for the technical assistance that the Gain Center is providing to the AOT grant program. And I'm also leading the Project Director Learning Community Calls, which will be held bi-monthly. Because of the topic, this was a natural fit to do a joint call with our housing community of practice. So this will also serve as the quarterly call for the housing community of practice. Mm-hmm. And just a couple of housekeeping items. First, a disclaimer: the views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, and policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Census Bureau and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. A couple of reminders. First of all, if you do not have your phone on mute, please do so. That will help keep the line clear so that everyone can hear what is being shared. And also, I ask that please remember that if you do need to leave the call, please do not put your phone on hold. We also are recording this webinar, so when we do have questions and answers at the end, we just want to make you aware of that. Quickly, our agenda, we're going to move quickly through the welcome and introductions. And Howard Burchman is a principal at Housing Innovations, has many years of experience working on this topic, on this issue, across jurisdictions across the nation. So while each of your jurisdictions have unique challenges when it comes to housing, he's familiar with that, and so we really look forward to the information he has to share today. At the end of the time, we'll try to wrap up around 1:40 or sooner, and we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Howard to get started with our presentation.
Great. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to be here. My name is Howard Burchman. As indicated, I am a principal with the organization called Housing Innovations. Just to, before I get started, let me give you just a brief rundown of my background. I've been actually working on housing-related issues since since the late 1970s. I started working after I worked briefly at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, basically on some policy research work. I came up to New York City and worked on what we were calling then sweat equity urban homesteading. It was a great model where we were taking abandoned multifamily buildings and bringing together people to work as homesteaders, turning them into long-term permanent low-income cooperatives, self-help cooperatives. We used a variety of both local and federal resources to do those kinds of projects. Sadly, most of those resources that we used are no longer available for that purpose. But one thing I will say is that those low-income cooperatives we developed in New York City and some of the greatest neighborhoods now, Williamsburg, the Lower East Side, those are remaining as low-income housing in that city, which has such a small quantity of it to this date. So very happy about that work. Later then worked with HUD to try and take that model of urban homesteading that we developed in New York City and replicate it in many other cities across the country. Basically, what ended up happening is then as the 80s came around, we saw a decline in federal involvement in housing affordability and saw also a rise in what we now are experiencing as the new phenomenon of homelessness among families and individuals in our cities. Worked extensively in New York City at the start of the homeless crisis. There served as the facilitator for the New York City's Continuum of Care, which is their banded together entity trying to address homelessness in the city. And then have also spent many years working on technical assistance for HUD, worked extensively on technical assistance both on HUD homeless assistance programs and on their housing opportunities for persons with HIV and AIDS programming. Also, while I was working in New York City, was retained by the what was then the State Division of Substance Abuse Services, since became the Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services, but worked with them extensively in the 80s, basically at the height of the crack epidemic. They originally retained us because they were encountering a problem within their drug treatment programs, which was that basically they had very few options to be able to place people upon the completion of the treatment, and they really retained us to try and work with their providers to try and find ways to be able to locate housing for their clients upon the completion of treatment. Also then work with them extensively to access HUD resources, especially HUD homeless assistance resources, to submit to support what was then their network of residential treatment centers. Then, as I said, went on to do quite a bit of technical assistance for HUD. And now Housing Innovations works with homeless continuums of care in many, many jurisdictions directly across this country. And we're also very, very pleased to work with the Department of Veterans Affairs in the implementation of the VA homeless programs and provide training and TA to VA providers across the country. Okay, so now moving on to the content here. Housing and recovery. There's no doubt that in the absence of stable housing, it is extraordinarily difficult to help people in the other aspects of their lives. People who are living without homes are living in a state of pretty much constant crises, and when one is in crisis, it is very difficult to focus on any issues that are different than those of immediate necessity and of immediate moment. Providing people with access to housing does indeed provide an opportunity to not have every minute of one's life in crisis and start to begin the process of being able to connect, both connect with services, connect with family, connect with other folks in the community. In the AIDS epidemic, we often referred to housing as health care, and there was frequently people early on in the AIDS epidemic, we realized in the absence of housing, it was going to be extremely difficult for people to be able to sustain their health. I've never really believed that housing equals health care. I believe that housing equals housing. However, my colleague Andrea White, I think, uses a great analogy that housing really represents shoes. I mean, in the absence of shoes, it is really hard to go about life, to be able to engage in any kind of normal activity. And the same thing about housing. It is absolutely essential in order to go about any kind of changes in life, to be able to institute anything in life. In the absence of housing, it is really next to impossible to make progress. However, housing, while it is essential, makes a lot of demands on people who are placed in housing. And those demands can sometimes lead to a loss of that housing, and housing, once it has been lost, can be very difficult to recover. Now, among the kinds of challenges that housing can present to people, especially people with extremely limited income, is the financial obligations. If there is any kind of a upside, a plus side to homelessness, it is that usually shelter has no cost associated with it. Therefore, it is a real adjustment to people who spent any period of time homeless or without any kind of set housing, the fact that maintaining housing requires that they set aside a significant portion of their income in order to meet the financial obligation of rent. I mean, even in subsidized housing, people have got to set aside at least 30% of their housing in order to, of their income rather, in order to meet their housing expenses. And with people who are living in extreme poverty, on any given day there could be many community demands for those limited financial resources. And committing that money to housing is not always the first response of people who have been homeless. And in addition to the cost of housing, there is obviously the cost of utilities, which is an essential expense and a variable expense as well, and highly difficult for people who've got very limited resources, not a great deal of experience in budgeting and things like that, to be able to do the kind of budgeting that is necessary to meet the financial obligations associated with housing. But there's more than financial obligations associated with housing that can be somewhat unfamiliar for folks to deal with. There is also legal requirements. The lease both provides rights and establishes obligations for participants. Obviously, the lease limits the people who can be occupying the premises on a long-term basis. And again, people who've got long histories of homelessness and things like that, many of the people that we're serving may never in their lives have had a lease in their own names, or if they did, it could have been many, many years in the past. And there's a lack of understanding of the legal requirements and the obligations that are associated with being in a unit. And sometimes, especially with folks who do not have a long history of housing, some of the demands of a lease, some of these obligations can be somewhat counterintuitive, and that does present a challenge for folks. They may be doing things that were perfectly acceptable in the street world in which they came from, but do not work that well in a housed situation. The other challenge that housing presents is the need to maintain that housing. And again, many folks will not necessarily be fully aware of what it is that they need to do. They may lack the skills. They may not lack the awareness of what it is they need to do to properly maintain a house, to maintain those essential standards so that they are compliant with the, yes?
Yes, I just wanted to tell you, I have several people in my office here, and we're having a real hard time understanding you. You're sounding real muffled.
Okay.
So I just didn't want you to keep talking. Just want to let you know that some of us, it sounds like you're, it's not a real good connection, just to let you know.
Does this sound better now?
Yeah, do it again.
Is it sounding better now?
That's much better.
Oh, my apologies. I switched microphones, so I'll stay with this microphone, and it should be clear.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great.
I really apologize for...
oh, no problem. I'm just glad. I just want to make it, because I want to hear what you're saying. It's really important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate your intervention. Very helpful.
You're very welcome.
Okay, so as I said, or as I was saying in hopefully now in a less muffled form, obviously, there are housekeeping challenges. Folks may not be aware of what those housekeeping requirements are, and they may not have experience in it, and they may even have some shame about reporting the fact that they're not familiar about it. So there really can be some burdens that people will experience on that end. And then finally, the last challenge I want to present that housing can present to folks is that for many folks, especially if they're able to access subsidized housing, this is probably the most significant asset they may have ever had in their life, they've never ever had before, and knowing how to handle that asset can be a real challenge. Again, it may be very difficult, for example, to tell friends who want to come and move into their house that if they're not on the lease, they're not able to do so. I mean, it seems like they've got an asset, but there are limitations on that asset. Some folks may have got relationships with some folks in the community which are less than positive relationships, such as with drug dealers and things like that. When some of those elements find out that there is housing involved, they may make efforts to try and occupy that housing and use it as their place of business. I mean, so I guess where I'm coming to is sometimes people presented with housing can themselves, because of that housing, become at risk of victimization as well. And many of the folks that we deal with are at considerable risk of being victimized a lot of the time. So housing presents a lot of challenges to folks as well. In addition to that, accessing housing, as I'm sure everyone is aware of, presents an extremely difficult challenge, and unfortunately one that is not going to get better. There was a Brookings Institute study in October of 2017 that showed that housing affordability is getting worse, particularly for low-income households. There was an analysis recently done by Freddie Mac which examined rent changes from a sample of apartment buildings that the company financed at least twice between 2010 and 2016. It wasn't easy for poor families to find an affordable housing in 2010. In fact, only 11.2% of unsubsidized apartments were affordable to low-income households in 2010. So 11.2% of unsubsidized apartments were affordable in 2010. In 2016, only 4.3% of those units still met that standard. So we've seen a huge decrease in a very short period of time in the private market sector units that are affordable to very low-income families. In addition to the fact that there are, lack of affordable housing, there is now widespread availability of criminal background check information, and its use is widespread among property owners. In part, as a result of this, HUD has recently tried to limit the impact of this. HUD, under the prior general counsel, under the prior administration, basically issued an opinion that the use of criminal background checks have a disproportionate impact on minorities, and has instructed property owners that you cannot institute a blanket ban on applicants with a criminal history, that property owners are required to focus on convictions, not arrests, and that comparable criminal histories must be considered similarly without consideration of race, national origin, or other protected classes of individuals. That owners are required by HUD to distinguish between criminal activity that poses demonstrable risk to resident safety and or property and criminal conduct that does not. Now, again, that is HUD's notice from their Office of their General Counsel. It's great guidance, not clear that all actors in the private sector are necessarily going to be following that guidance, but does highlight the fact that background checks and issues really are creating very large barriers to accessing housing, and those barriers disproportionately affect certain classes of people. HUD, at the same time as we see that there are both, decreases in the availability of affordable housing and barriers to accessing that housing, HUD at the same time is adjusting its policy with regard to housing extremely vulnerable populations. This is HUD's housing programs that serve the most vulnerable folks are those among their array of homeless assistance programs. And on their homeless assistance programs, HUD really is requiring that communities prioritize those homeless assistance towards those folks who are chronically homeless, those who have got the longest time homelessness, and those who have the most severe service needs. This could impact the availability of homeless resources for clients coming in the AOT system because they may not necessarily meet all of HUD's definitions, and they may not necessarily meet HUD's priorities for accessing homeless housing. Also, HUD is also pushing, especially in the homeless assistance field, is really pushing all of their providers to follow the Housing First model, which minimizes the preconditions for entry into housing, such as sobriety and income and background checks, and is focused very much on voluntary participation in services. HUD's policy is that unless court-ordered, HUD does not believe that people should be required to enter recovery housing, but that housing choices and options should be presented, which can include recovery housing, and HUD does see that as a valuable choice. However, HUD, certainly in the homeless assistance programs, really strongly emphasizes that those should not be the only choice that are available to program participants. And as I say, there is, because of the emphasis and the really strong emphasis on HUD on the Housing First model, there is decreasing HUD-funded homeless assistance that is either treatment or recovery focused. Okay. Now, it is a continued challenge to maintain housing and to meet the requisite responsibilities of housing. A very significant percentage of folks are going to leave housing even if the housing is affordable. So in order to sustain housing on a long-term basis, people really have to have a stake. They've got to have an equity in that housing. Unless we help people to understand and really be committed to that housing, the chances are very great that when a crisis comes along, they may simply leave it. Probably among certainly the largest of the supported housing programs that exist in the country today is the HUD Voucher program, which is the joint venture between the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Veterans Affairs. And it's a really notable program because in addition to providing Section 8 subsidies, housing choice vouchers to all the veterans who participate in that program, and that is a permanent, highly affordable subsidy, it also ensures that housing stabilization case management services are provided to all those veterans, that in-home services are provided to those veterans. And the VA, as I'm sure everyone knows, is a massive healthcare system that really can provide extensive supportive resources to veterans. So in many cases, I think the HUD Voucher model presents, so the optimal model of serving folks who've got challenging histories and providing both a really strong subsidy and very strong supportive case management services. And at the same time, although this is a great measure of success, only 87% of those people who are housed in the HUD Voucher program maintain that housing for at least a year. 13% of those provided a long-term permanent subsidy with really good quality case management still do not continue that housing. Now, some of those folks don't continue that housing because they have successful outcome. A lot of the veterans that are housed are actually able to get what is called a service-connected disability, and those pensions often are sufficient to make the veterans over income for the housing voucher program, and that's why some of the people leave. But there are, even in those 13%, there are a fairly high, probably about 6, 7, 8% of those exits are actually negative exits. So I think it's inevitable and one has to understand that any kind of these assistance programs, especially with folks with very challenging histories, even the best program is going to have some level of turnover, even with affordability, even with great housing stabilization, case management, there is going to be some turnover. But in the absence of those two elements, the ability to maintain housing is going to be, of course, much more difficult. So what are the kinds of options that we can look at in terms of being able to secure housing for folks? Now, clearly, accessing affordable housing and subsidies is a key element of it, and will be essential for as many participants as you can secure it for. However, as in many things, the subsidies that are needed for long-term affordability and stability unfortunately at great risk from the current budget. We do know that we continue to work on the federal level on a continuing resolution, and what we do not know is where the federal budget is for 2018 is going to end up. But the current budget proposals are talking about really reducing federal investments in affordable housing at HUD by nearly 70% reduction, or a reduction of $7.7 billion compared to the fiscal year 17 budget. The proposed cuts in housing assistance could mean that as many as 250,000 people could lose housing vouchers. The new National Housing Trust Fund, which was just established, is slated to be eliminated. The Community Development Block Grant programs, the Home Investment Partnership Program, and the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, as well as the Community Services Block Grant programs, are all at risk of being cut in the upcoming budget. All of these things, if these things come to pass, it's going to be extremely, even more challenging to secure affordable housing, certainly with the benefit of federal subsidies. If affordable housing is not going to be possible, we've got to look at ways in which housing can be more affordable. One of the ways, it's what people sort of naturally do, and one of the things that we need to be looking at is what we're calling shared housing model. Now, in some respects, shared housing can be slightly problematic because we know that sometimes because of the absence of housing, because of the risk of homelessness, entire families are going to double up or triple up in the individual dwelling unit. And we know that HUD has always recognized that overcrowding is really a hallmark of substandard housing, and we do not want to have substandard housing for folks. So we do not want to excessively share our housing, but there certainly are many times where a two-bedroom or a three-bedroom unit could be shared by 2 or 3 individuals. We know that one-bedroom and studio units tend to be relatively scarce in many of the markets where we're looking for them, and that for many of our clients to be able to afford a one-bedroom or studio unit on their own is next to impossible. And so therefore, trying to find ways, either formally or informally, to share housing seems to be one of the models that we just cannot avoid, because it's one of the few ways in which we're able to get people under the roof. Sharing housing is always going to be complex. It is a roommate situation. Those kinds of situations can always go bad, but it is possible to make it work, and it's something that needs to be looked at in many instances. And then finally, what is going to happen is that episodic homelessness is not an intended outcome, but it is a likely outcome for many. People will run through their available options. They may, on a short-term basis, be able to stay with somebody else, but they may cycle in and out of shelters. Sometimes people will do that on a planned basis to be able to use that short stay in a shelter to be able to come up with some more resources, or try to, less wear out their welcome where they may be able to go, and people will cycle through various things. Episodic homelessness is not a good place for people to be, and it will be a very dangerous and difficult place in order to have any kind of sustained access to services that way. Looking at the affordable housing options, we know that there are probably the largest source of subsidized housing is in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which for many, many years was referred to as the Section 8 program, and is in many cases still referred to as Section 8. I'll talk about some of the issues with vouchers and accessing them as I go on. The other possible resource is the public housing program. In public housing, as opposed to the difference between the vouchers and public housing, of course, is public housing is associated with specific housing developments that have been subsidized by the government and provide permanent housing that way. The voucher program allows people to go through privately owned housing and to secure those private units elsewhere in the community. Both of those provide good opportunities for providing long-term permanent housing, but there are a number of restrictions on entering that housing that I'm going to talk about, and ways in which one can sometimes get beyond those restrictions. In addition to that, there are other subsidized housing options. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program is really the primary vehicle that we've been using to develop subsidized housing in this country. It has been an extremely effective resource. It has been combined in many instances with the Home Investment Partnership Program and other federal resources. As I indicated before, I mean, one of the reasons that the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program has worked has been because we have had a fairly high tax rate on corporations in this country, and the tax credit program has been a way for corporations to basically both address their tax obligations and support the development of affordable housing. Should we, as may be likely, substantially decrease the tax rate on corporations, that could end up resulting in a less attractive tax credit environment. If the tax obligations of corporations are lessened, they'll have a less need to purchase tax credits, and that could be hampering ability to develop affordable housing in that manner. The other thing, the approach that I will talk about as well, are the designated homeless assistance programs. I think they can be a great opportunity. Unlike virtually all of the other affordable housing programs that are facing the possibility of fairly significant reductions in funding, the homeless assistance programs have been really kept pretty much constant in funding and maybe even seeing some slight increases, so one has to pay attention to them as a potential resource as well. Let's talk about how the issues that are associated with the housing choice vouchers and public housing. Obviously, we know the great advantage of either the voucher program or the public housing program is that there are subsidies that cover the difference between the actual cost of the housing and the price that is affordable to participants. The HUD and federal standard, of course, as everyone knows, has become that now affordability is considered as paying no more than 30% of your adjusted income. For housing, both public housing and the Section 8 program do that quite well. They can operate as scatter site as the voucher program works, which really provides a lot of benefit. It gives people a choice. One of the big things that we do, again, as I indicated before, when one is placing people on housing, there is always the risk of people losing that housing, of not having sufficient commitment to retaining that housing. One of the ways into try and build up stake in that housing is by really providing people choice in the initial selection of the housing. If people choose the housing that they're in, it works much more towards ensuring that they have some sort of a commitment to the housing and willing to make some sacrifices to maintain that housing. If they're simply placed in the housing without having much commitment to the housing, it does become a greater barrier towards and a greater burden towards getting those folks really to make sacrifices to keep that housing and to, sacrifice income and other things to maintain that housing. In many cases, both PHAs and owners of housing have every right to conduct background checks on individuals, and some folks, if they've got a criminal history, if they've got a recent eviction history and things like that, are going to have great difficulties in accessing that housing in the community. They will face the risk of being screened out of that housing. Obviously, finding ways to access subsidies is going to be, or units of public housing is going to be a huge, and I'm sure you're experiencing that, a huge challenge. HUD has a set of rules under which public housing authorities can either accept or not accept folks into their public housing and their voucher programs. The HUD rules sort of have a difference between what the public housing authorities must do and what they may do. So PHAs are allowed to deny assistance if folks have ever been evicted from federally assisted housing, if they've ever had their assistance terminated by a PHA, if there is fraud has been committed or another criminal act, if there's an outstanding debt to the PHA, or if a family member is engaged in or has been engaged in drug-related or violent criminal activity. But understand, all of these issues that I've indicated here are just grounds that they may deny admission from. They are not required to deny assistance because of these grounds, and one can argue, and I will provide the reasons shortly as to how one could argue as to why the assistance should not always be denied to some of your clients who may have some of these background histories. That being said, there are some circumstances where where the PHA has no alternative but to deny admission to folks, and if they fall into these categories, these are mandatory exclusions, and one can't get around it. So, again, if a household member has been evicted from federally assisted housing for drug-related offenses within the past 3 years, the PHAs are not allowed to provide them with federal housing assistance within that three-year period of time. They must also prohibit admission. They cannot admit anybody if they determine that any member of the household is engaged in illegal drug use, or this is a real huge no-no for HUD. If any household member has ever been convicted of manufacture or production of methamphetamines on the premises of federally assisted housing, forget about it. That is a huge no-no. One is not allowed to enter federal housing assistance after having committed that offense. Also, as I'm sure you know, folks who are on a lifetime sex offender registry cannot be accepted into PHA-owned housing. Folks who are on the lifetime sex offender registries have huge, as I'm sure you all know, difficulties in being able to access housing anywhere. Obviously, there are many restrictions. There are those registries, and there are restrictions in terms of where people on those registries are able to live. The restrictions vary state by state. They tend to be very onerous, so there's locational difficulties. Most subsidy programs are going to ban them forever. Probably the only place assisted housing resources that one could get for folks who've got that kind of assistance, that kind of a history, is in through the HUD's homeless assistance resources, which do not have that blanket prohibition. But that obviously folks who've got any on a lifetime state sex offender registry are going to be extremely challenging to find housing for. Now, I've indicated that PHAs must or may deny admission to folks, but I'd also like to point out that any decision that is made by a public housing authority is a decision that can and probably should be appealed. And any decision that affects either the initial eligibility or the amount of assistance is appealable. Every PHA has got their own specific procedures that they allow in terms of how it is one appeals those decisions. And there are due process rights. There are also, if the PHA does not accept that initial appeal, there is the possibility of further appealing to HUD. Now, with respect to the PHA decisions, I'm going to cover this in a few minutes, but what you want to do if you are appealing a negative decision by the PHA is to see if there are any grounds for a reasonable accommodation. If your client has some disability, that is something you want to look at as a possible way to be able to use as a basis for appeal of a PHA decisions. As I indicated before, there are HUD's homeless assistance programs could be a way to turn to as a housing resource for some AOT participants. There are two channels for the HUD's homeless assistance programs. One is through the Continuum of Care program. The Continuum of Care program is a national competition. Happens every year, generally speaking, in the fall. It works with these continuums of care that are basically informal associations of providers in each community who band together to do homeless services planning. Those continuum of care applications include applications from specific housing providers to either provide permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, transitional housing for formerly homeless folks. In addition to the continuum of care program, there is also, that is a competitive award. There is also the Emergency Solutions Grant program. Emergency Solutions Grant is what HUD calls a formula-based program, which means those funds are allocated to communities based on these complex formulas that HUD develops that talk about extent of homelessness, extent of poverty, condition of housing, factors like that, which lead to those distribution of resources. Under the Emergency Solutions Grant program, there can be both homeless prevention and rapid rehousing provided to folks who were formerly homeless. If it's permanent housing, it provides long-term housing. For permanent housing and HUD's homeless assistance programs, you need to be in addition to being homeless, and we'll talk about what being homeless means according to the HUD definition, you also have to be disabled in order to get permanent housing under HUD's assistance programs. I'm going to also talk about what it means, what HUD's definition of disability is. But remember, in order to get that permanent housing through the homeless assistance programs, folks both need to meet the definitions of homelessness and people with disabilities. If it's not permanent housing, then HUD's other housing resources under their homeless assistance programs are going to provide up to 2 years' worth of assistance, either through their rapid rehousing program or through transitional housing programs. Let me go on, and then I'll talk about what the definitions are. Okay. In order to be eligible for homeless assistance, obviously you've got to you meet the definition of homelessness. There are some instances, especially under the Emergency Solutions Grant, where it's homelessness prevention, that you need to show that you are at imminent risk of becoming homeless, not necessarily literally homeless. You're expected to have very low incomes. Certainly on the Emergency Solutions Grant side of homeless assistance, people's income cannot exceed 30% of the area median. Generally speaking, in either the public housing or the voucher programs, incomes cannot exceed 50% of the area median. So income eligibility on the homeless side is going to be, not surprisingly, lower than is in the regular affordable housing side. HUD does not want their homeless assistance to take over the housing needs of all programs and services in the society. So basically, the HUD says that folks who have been institutionalized, either hospitalized in mental health treatment settings, even in substance use treatment settings, that people have been in institutional settings or incarcerated for 90 days or longer, HUD no longer considers those folks to be homeless. As I've indicated before, HUD really is strongly encouraging communities to follow the Housing First model, which basically both limits restrictions on the intake into housing, and it also limits reasons upon which people can be removed from housing, terminated from housing, and generally speaking, HUD tries to have termination occur only in the most extreme cases, and generally does not want to associate, termination with simple things like substance use. It wants to associate termination from housing with actual lease violations as opposed to behavioral issues. HUD does discourage systems of institutional care from discharging people directly into homelessness. Going into the HUD's homeless definition categories, HUD is great at defining people, and they basically say that there are 4 different categories of homeless folks. They target virtually all of their homeless assistance towards what they call the Category 1 homeless folks. That's what I've got listed here under number 1. And those are what they call the literally homeless population, people who are sleeping in places not intended for living accommodations for human beings, so sheds, garages, just outdoors, public transit facilities, airports, subways, all kinds of things like that. Those are all considered, of course, to be literally homeless. Anybody who is residing in a designated homeless shelter is, of course, considered by HUD to be meeting the definition of homeless. And people who were in any kind of institution, as long as they were in that institutional setting, and it can include a jail, it can include a hospital, it can include a treatment setting, as long as they're in that setting for fewer than 90 days and they were literally homeless prior to entering that facility, HUD will consider those folks to be homeless. There is the possibility, there are very, very limited allowability in the HUD's homeless assistance programs for folks who are at imminent risk of losing their housing. Generally speaking, the only folks who are eligible, or the only housing options that are eligible for these folks who are at imminent risk of losing their housing, is to move into HUD-funded transitional housing. HUD has been on a multi-year effort to reduce the amount of transitional housing that is supported through their homeless assistance programs. So therefore, that there is the possibility of serving people who are at imminent risk of losing their housing, but the options are pretty limited, and HUD is really trying to discourage the extent to which, really, again, HUD's goal is to show that it's having an impact on the overall level of homelessness in the country, and it's doing that by targeting assistance to people who are literally homeless. There is this provision in their homeless assistance statutes to say that HUD's housing assistance can be used to help unaccompanied youth and families with children and youth who were defined as homeless under other federal statutes under certain limited conditions. HUD basically has established that in order to serve people under their homeless programs who meet other federal definitions of homelessness, they must basically first apply to HUD and get permission to serve those populations. As of this time, HUD has not allowed anyone in any part of the country to use their homeless assistance to serve people who are homeless under other federal definitions. What this really comes down to, by the way, is it's under the, used to be the educational components of the McKinney-Vento Act, now it's the Every Student Succeeds Act, and under that, it does recognize under the educational components, they recognize people as being homeless as those who are living in somebody else's house because they do not have a house of their own to live in. HUD very much does not recognize those doubled-up households as being homeless. So you'll see a big difference between the number of people who reported homeless on the educational side and those who reported as homeless on the HUD side. Finally, HUD does recognize that domestic violence and human trafficking are huge issues in this country today, and it recognizes that people who are fleeing domestic violence or human trafficking are indeed homeless, and people who are in those desperate situations are indeed able to access HUD homeless resources and can indeed self-certify the eligibility for HUD homeless resources too. Okay, that's the definition of homeless. As I indicated, in order to get permanent housing from HUD's homeless assistance side, you must both be literally homeless and also be an individual, have a household that has a person with a disability in it. Understand that every federal agency tends to define disabilities somewhat differently. HUD's definition of disability is what we've got on the screen in front of you, and basically HUD says an individual with a disability is someone that has a condition that is of long continued and indefinite duration. It impedes the individual's ability to live independently, and it could be improved by more suitable housing conditions. Within the homeless side, HUD is very specific that that disability can be a physical, mental, or emotional impairment, including an impairment caused by alcohol or drug abuse, post-traumatic stress, or brain injury. So HUD, at least in their homeless assistance programs, will recognize an impairment caused by alcohol or drug abuse to be a disabling condition and will allow somebody with that diagnosis to be considered disabled and eligible for permanent housing under their homeless assistance programs. In addition to that definition, clearly people who've got a developmental disability or a physical disability are considered to be people with disabilities, and HUD continues to consider that anyone who has HIV or has progressed to AIDS is considered to be a person with disabilities and is going to be eligible under their homeless assistance programs. I've kind of indicated before, HUD is really it used to be under their homeless assistance programs that each individual provider made the decision as to who was going to be admitted to the program and who was going to be served under that program. And what we have found is that HUD was finding that many of the providers were not necessarily serving the folks who were the hardest to serve, who had the longest histories of homelessness, who had the most challenging histories, but in some instances were accepting folks who could, in some instances, be the easiest folks for those individual programs to be able to serve on an ongoing basis. HUD basically has changed this to indicate that all communities, and this is a requirement that by January of next year, all communities are going to be required to implement a coordinated entry system for their homeless assistance. So there should be either a single point of entry or a coordinated entrance system for all folks. So there will be a common entry point into homeless assistance in all communities. Also, HUD wants all communities to use a single instrument. Not any communities are free to choose their own instruments, but all communities must use a single assessment instrument to determine the severity of need and to use that as a way to prioritize people for assistance. Across the country, communities are overwhelmingly using this tool called the VI-SPDAT, the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assessment Tool, as a way of screening folks. People get a score based on that, and basically communities are establishing that the eligibility, especially for their permanent housing, is going to be based on the score that folks have and the length of time homelessness that people have. And the goal is to move away from basically housing placement being how long you've been on the waiting list for housing and move it towards who's got the greatest need for the housing and who could be best served for this housing. I see that there was a question raised as to asking me to clarify HUD's definition of chronic homelessness, and let me spend a moment doing that. So in order to be chronically homeless, first one needs to be a chronic homeless household is one that has been homeless for a long period of time. Generally speaking, a chronically homeless household has either had 365 days of continuous uninterrupted homelessness or has had what they call 4 periods of homelessness in a period of 3 years, such that the amount of time that one has been homeless totals up to that 365-day period. HUD is actually quite literal about that 4 different periods of homelessness in the 3-year period of time. They really expect there to be 4. If you have not had 365 continuous days of homelessness, they do expect you to have those 4, what they sometimes call episodes of homelessness within the 3-year period of time. And those periods of homelessness have actually got to be interrupted by a break in which those folks are housed, and then they return to homelessness in order to meet the chronic homeless test. In addition to the length of time that one is homeless, the other side of the chronic homeless test is the household must be a disabled household to qualify for chronic homelessness. And in chronic homelessness, only the head of the household or the co-head of the household can be the disabled person. So in order to be chronically homeless, you need to have a head of the household or the co-head of the household being a person with disabilities, and they've got to have a long-term period of homelessness. Generally speaking, it's got to be at least a 1-year period of homelessness in order to qualify as chronically homeless. The questioner raised this thing. This is true. Much of the inventory of HUD's homeless assistance housing is going to be dedicated or what they call prioritized to the chronically homeless. So if you've got folks that meet that chronic homeless definition, they are going to be much more likely to be able to access this homeless assistance than folks who do not currently meet that definition. HUD is very much trying to demonstrate that it's ending chronic homelessness in the communities. Among the reasons they are doing it is because studies have demonstrated very conclusively that people who are chronically homeless consume disproportionately high levels of services, and if we can target our services towards those people, we can have our greatest impact on ending homelessness and decreasing the impacts on our community. In addition to the homeless assistance programs, there is also the Housing Opportunity for Persons with AIDS program, and indeed, if you have, and the eligibility for the housing opportunities for persons with AIDS is obviously you need to, person or the household has got to have at least one member who is either HIV positive or diagnosed with HIV or AIDS, and it's got to be a low-income household, but that's just low income, so that means their income has got to be below 80% of the area median or lower, and they've got to have HIV or AIDS. It is a HOPLA is a very good program. It's been around since the height of the AIDS epidemic, and it's been continuously funded by the government, not really at risk of not being funded at this point in time. It can provide both short-term assistance, and it does provide long-term support, both through tenant-based rental assistance and what they call facility-based housing. This is not a competitive program. The funding for the HOPLA program is like the Emergency Solutions Grant, is allocated to communities by a formula allocation. HUD has actually just updated that formula, how that assistance is allocated, and they're holding communities harmless because it's really changing. It used to be, their formula used to be based on the cumulative cases of AIDS in the community. That meant people who were both living and deceased who had AIDS. And now the formula is being changed, and it's only going to be counting living people with HIV in the community, which makes a lot more sense. So we're going to see some of that funding for HOPLA changed around. They're going to try and phase it in because some communities are going to lose funding as a result of this changes in the formula. HUD is going to try to minimize the impact of that, but you will start seeing more of these resources, HOPLA resources, going to other parts of the country that have been somewhat underserved by HOPLA because of the old formula that they have used in the past. So certainly if you've got anybody with HIV or AIDS, HOPLA is another resource to certainly consider. Probably the only downside or the challenge in it is the program has been around for a while. A lot of the permanent, and thank God, we have made huge advances in the treatment of HIV. We all know this, and therefore people with HIV are, again, thanks be, living much, much, much longer than they had in the past, and therefore it means that the turnover in HUD-supported HIV housing is less than it used to be, which means that the housing can be somewhat difficult to access.
So that kind of doesn't allow. What's the issue with how they can transition out of that?
Okay. Now, I indicated before, if one is having challenges accessing, especially public housing or the Housing Choice Voucher program, one wants to pay attention to the concept of reasonable accommodations. Reasonable accommodations came in as part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and basically what reasonable accommodations say is that, that basically people, by virtue of their disability, should not have experienced any hindrances in being able to access federal assistance programs. And if there are some barriers to people with disabilities being able to access federal assistance resources, then reasonable accommodations must be made to allow those people with disabilities to be able to access federal assistance, including housing assistance, the way other people in the community are able to do so. So with respect to disabilities and reasonable accommodations, a individual with disability, as we indicated, as far as reasonable accommodations, is any person with a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And a reasonable accommodation is something that will allow a qualified person with disability to fully participate in the program. And in order to request a reasonable accommodation, one has got to establish the connection between what they call the nexus. You've got to do a linkage between the person's disability and the accommodation that is being requested. So, I mean, for example, I mean, if indeed the person's issue is that they've had, long-term drug dependency, some issues like that, other dependencies like that, and that has made it very difficult for them to be able to access and maintain housing, and may have caused them to have other issues in their life that are coming up in background checks and other issues like that. This is where you want to try and make a linkage between that person's underlying disability and the reasons why they have not been able to succeed elsewhere in housing, and why you're going to ask this connection to allow them to be accepted into this housing program. A reasonable accommodation is something that has to be decided on a case-by-case basis. It can't be done on a blanket thing. There are only two reasons for denying a reasonable accommodation request, and that is if it imposes an undue financial and administrative burden on folks, or would it, providing the accommodation, require a fundamental change in how the provider operates. If a reasonable accommodation request, and basically, if your client has applied for either a voucher or applied for public housing and has been denied that admission, one can sometimes appeal that denial by virtue of a reasonable accommodation to indicate that there was a disability. That disability could have been among the reasons leading towards the reason why that assistance was being denied, and indicate how the supportive services that are available from the program can assist that participant in overcoming those issues, and why they should be able to participate in the program. If the denial of a request for a reasonable accommodation can, in some instances, be appealed to HUD's Office of Fair Housing, because that's who administers these protections, and the Federal Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination based on disabilities. So with respect to potential, reasonable accommodations and criminal background issues, even if there's a criminal background, the PHAs are allowed or expected to consider both the severity of crime, the extent to which the person was actually culpable for it, the evidence that they have been rehabilitated, maybe getting circumstances related to the disability. These can all be reasons why, on those reasons why the PHA may deny. If they must deny assistance, they must deny it. But on grounds where they may deny it, one wants to ask them to consider these kinds of issues as to why to potentially make a reasonable accommodation thing. And again, always try to show that connection between the disability and the thing that one's asking the request around. If it can be demonstrated that treatment or other services have addressed the behavior, then the PHA can ease their rules regarding ineligibility due to background issues. So as I said, it will be an issue. It could be a challenge, but in and of itself, those issues aren't necessarily going to exclude folks from housing. I want to point out, as we go through the non-government supported model, there is in many communities the Oxford House model. There are over 1,200 of these self-sustaining sober housing in the community. It is this is a democratically run. There is a clear model for this program. A lot of the folks who participate in the Oxford House model have had some period of time that they've been incarcerated. There's no limit on stay. It really is. It's a model of a formal shared housing model where people are working, banding together to try and build, help them sustain their sobriety, and basically pooling their incomes together in order to be able to afford that housing. This a link here where you can find out where there are Oxford House models in their community. As I said, either formally or informally by establishing kinds of roommate shared housing models. These are ways in which one can sort of start to use the available housing stock and increase the housing opportunities without necessarily having to access federal housing assistance, which we know is going to be necessary. Basically, in the Oxford House model, people apply to the housing. If there's a vacancy and the residents vote to approve the new member to come in, they both can. Houses tend to serve just a single gender, but both men and women are served under the Oxford House model. In addition to that, there are, as I've implied before, there are substantial resources, additional resources that can serve people who are at great housing risk and who have served in the U.S. military, and especially those who are eligible to receive services from the Department of Veterans Affairs. There are a lot of resources that they have available. The Veterans Justice Outreach Program is a great resource. It works very much with veterans who are incarcerated. It helps bridge the transition from incarceration to the community. They liaison with both the local justice system and the local VA medical centers, and it's a really it's an excellent outreach effort to try and bring in veterans who have had some involvement with the criminal justice system. I've indicated before, the HUD Voucher program has become the largest supportive housing program in this country, probably in the world. Therefore, it's supporting nearly 80,000 veterans at this point in time. Now, a lot of the reasons why people are sometimes excluded from the voucher or the public housing programs because of their criminal backgrounds and other issues like that, all of those factors, screening factors that are widely used by PHAs, are not allowed to be used or specifically excluded from being able to be used in the HUD Voucher program. So the only reasons why a veteran would not be accepted into the HUD Voucher program is either because he or she is on the Lifetime Sex Offenders Registry or they are over income for the area. Those are the only two reasons why why admission to that program can be denied. So again, if you are serving someone who has served in the military, obviously you want to reach out to the VA to determine whether or not that individual can be available for any of the VA homeless programs. And in addition to having access to the Housing Choice Voucher, which is a great long-term permanent housing resource, there's also case management by VA case managers, and the VA uses very much of an integrated treatment team model. So their case management teams are not only going to include case managers, but they're going to include substance use disorder specialists. They're going to include employment specialists. They're going to include peer support specialists. They're going to include, in many cases, occupational therapists and nurses. So they can really provide extremely comprehensive services to help people, veterans, remain in housing. As I indicated at the start, despite that huge array of resources they bring to bear, even in that well-resourced program, there is a risk of veterans losing that housing that's available under the program. But clearly, if you've got someone who's served in the military, very much try to connect them with those VA resources.
Yeah.
So basically, in terms of the options that we need to look at as far as available housing is, there are local housing resources through the voucher program, through public housing. We understand that there may be some challenges for clients being able to access those programs. You want to work with your PHE to see whether you can get around some of those barriers to admission into the programs. Look at reasonable accommodations as a potential reason as to try and get beyond some barriers that may have been established for folks being able to access housing. There are, as I said, through the HUD Homeless Assistance Resource Programs, the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS, there are some housing opportunities for HUD that do not pay a lot of reliance towards people's backgrounds, criminal backgrounds, other screening factors, and things like that, and they can be a way in which people can get assistance. But of course, under the HUD Homeless Assistance, you can know it's going to be prioritized towards those who are chronically homeless and have long histories of homelessness, and it's going to be following that Housing First model, which may or may not relate well with the model of services that you're working on. Also, as we said, formal through the Oxford House model or informal shared housing is a way to, one way that we can deal with to try and increase housing affordability, to try and keep people housing. And as I have indicated before, if the client that you're serving has served in the military, they may be eligible for services from the VA. A lot of folks, if they do not have what they call, a good discharge from the VA, may not be eligible for all their services. But even folks who do have bad discharges from the VA are able to get some services from some of the VA homeless programs under what they call humanitarian exceptions. So that's something to consider as well, even if you got a veteran who does not have a good discharge from the military. Okay, so here are a list of some resources about the Housing Choice Voucher Guidebook. HUD has got this resource exchange, which is a great resource on information on HUD homeless assistance programs. If you want to explore a little more about what I was talking about on reasonable accommodations, here is a great link for that. Here is a link to explore the Oxford House model a little more, and here is the link to the homepage for the VA homeless resources. Okay, and here is my contact information, and that sort of concludes what I have to say. So I see it's a little after 1:30 Eastern time, that is, and the floor is open for any further questions that you might have.
So this is Melissa. I'm going to jump in just right quick and let you all know of a couple of other housekeeping items before we move into questions. And first of all, we do want to make sure that we have note of everyone who is participating on today's call. So during the question and answer, if you could just write in the chat box everyone from your jurisdiction that is participating on the call today, we want to have record of that. And instead of interrupting the Q&A section, it'd just be more convenient if we can all just type in the chat box who all is participating. Okay. So as I mentioned before, is there someone with a question? Okay. So as I mentioned before, this is a joint call with the Housing Community of Practice, and we wanted to remind all of you that there will be office hours, and Howard and Housing Innovations will continue to be a part of the Housing Community of Practice. And so if you would like some one-on-one opportunities to directly interact with Howard and to troubleshoot some issues locally, then please do reach out to Ashley Schultz with a request for office hours. Following this webinar, we will have 3 more. 2 are planned for March and June, and then a final webinar on sustainability and housing planned for September. And just one further reminder about the Housing Community of Practice, we want to make sure that everyone in your jurisdiction is participating. So if there's anyone involved with your AOT grant program that also could really either help or are very interested in housing issues, please forward the information about this community of practice to them so we can loop them in. Also, we don't have a slide for the next Project Director Learning Community call, but we do want to make sure all of the project directors are aware that the next Project Director Learning Community call will take place on January the 12th. And that time, that is going to be at 3 o'clock. so now we'll get back to the presentation and the Q&A. So please do, even if you have questions specific to your area, please go ahead and, join the conversation and let Howard know what questions you may have, because the other jurisdictions might learn from your questions. Okay, so without further ado, question and answer time. Okay, well, if there aren't any questions, then Howard, I just want to maybe ask, specific to AOT, what are some of the major issues that you see are common, particularly with the AOT population in the work that you've done so far?
In terms of being able to access housing?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think I was implying it. I mean, I think the big issues are going to be certainly the lack of a housing history that is going to make private sector landlords eager to rent to folks. Challenging backgrounds. I mean, obviously, all these background checks that are going on, any kind of criminal convictions and things like that, certainly make accessing housing much more challenging. And then finally, I mean, this just remains the essential issue of affordability and budgeting, and that on any given day, people have got competing interests and competing needs, and putting aside the money for housing every day is a challenge for folks.
Well, the only other thing was we have shared housing, but I don't know if they let us.
Now, is that a question that I hear? Okay.
You can't hear the question. Melissa, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Miriam.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Howard. I really appreciate all your wonderful presentation. I have two questions. First of all, I don't know if I understand it well. You said you don't believe that housing is a determinant of health, which is proven lately. I mean, what was your position on that issue or that concept?
Well, I guess, what I was questioning, I know people used to say, and especially the HIV community, people used to say housing is healthcare, and I think housing is housing, and healthcare is healthcare. I think they are. I mean, in the absence of housing, it is very difficult to sustain or maintain health, especially with people who've got, challenging medical issues. But they are very separate things. I mean, I don't think that housing should be equated with healthcare. Healthcare is a separate matter. It is the essential element in order to be able to provide that stability. I guess that was the only point that I was trying to make.
Great. That's great. I mean, I don't see eye to eye with you, but that's the legitimate position that you have. Because in terms of the hierarchical of the needs of the individual to be able to live a continuum of healthy lives, and if you don't have housing on top of really serious mental illness that you're dealing with, the AOT participant and other grantees, we'll see that their health is declining drastically without the shelter, without the permanent housing. So that is definitely a big factor. But thank you so much. And the other thing that you mentioned something about court order housing. We have grantees that are dealing with, of course, judges that they are court ordering individual into housing, while the grantees really don't have the facilities or enough housing to put everybody on AOT program into the housing. So my question is, first of all, how the grantee deal with that court order, and the other one, does HUD have any flexibility in terms of court order housing, and how do they deal with that?
Well, certainly, with respect to the first part of the question, in terms of what does the program do if the court has ordered housing but does not have the resources to provide that housing? I don't have a good answer that one. With respect to the HUD one, I think I can answer it more. And HUD does indeed recognize that there are indeed those orders, and HUD certainly in its programs would respect that level of determination and would accept recovery housing under those circumstances, that in question. So HUD certainly recognizes that there are instances when that is a court-ordered thing, and HUD would respect that and would allow that assistance to go on. I mean, in the I don't know what happens to a nonprofit service provider if a court is ordered and then provide housing for a client and they do not have the financial resource to provide that housing. I don't have a good answer for that one.
Okay. Well, that's a very difficult situation, and I don't blame you.
I can see.
And one of our grantees really dealing with that issue, and maybe if they can work a little bit more closely with their interagency council of homelessness on local coordinating council or whatever, coalition of homelessness in their county or state, maybe considering HUD respectful of court order, maybe they can come up with some plan, hopefully.
And that might be one for us to follow up with on the office hours, where we can sort of dive into the particulars in that community and see what other resources might be available there.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Okay, we've had a lot of participants on this webinar. Any questions? All right. Well, I also want to give anyone an opportunity, if you've not had a chance to, if you're not able to enter in the chat box your participation, if there's anyone on the line that would like to indicate that they've participated, if they haven't been able to put that in the chat box, please let us know.
This is Catherine Thompson, and I'm calling from Jackson, Mississippi AOT program with Hans Avery Health Services.
This is Frank Garcia, AOT Supervisor, Edinburgh, Texas.
Hi, I'm sorry. Who is from Jackson, Mississippi?
Cambria Thompson, AOT Team Leader.
Thank you.
This is Jamie Michael from Doñana County, New Mexico, project director, and I'm here with several other folks in our community. I'll let them briefly introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Mari Tejas, with program coordinator.
And my name is Michelle Baldwin, AOT Housing Navigator with Mesilla Valley Community of Hope.
And we also have Diana Portillo with La Clinica, as well as Sylvia Robles.
Thank you. Anyone else not able to enter in the chat box your participation and would like to speak up?
Hello?
Go ahead.
Candice Alaei, Northern Nevada Adult Mental Health Services, AOT program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, once we have everyone finished typing in or just speaking their participation on today's call, we'll wrap things up. As we're waiting, though, one last call. Any questions for Howard? Okay, with that, we will end today's presentation. Thanks so much for all of your participation. Again, we will have some upcoming emails coming out regarding the next three Housing Community of Practice webinars. And our next Project Director Learning Community call will be on January 12th. So thank you so much, and thank you, Howard, for all of this information you provided today.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
All
Thank
right.
you so much. All right.
Thank you
Happy
all.
holidays, everybody.
Happy holidays.
The leader has disconnected. The conference will be terminated in 5